Welcome to the Veritas Podcast, the show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church.
He's Rob, and I'm Rob. This is the Veritas Podcast. This is our first episode. Our intention is to go through important papal writings and give our impressions of it, a pretty in-depth study of it. We're nobody special. He's just a guy that's really involved in his faith. I'm just a guy who really wants to learn more about his faith as well. And so we invite you just to listen and to study along with us. This first episode, and probably for a few more episodes, we're studying Libertas. It's the encyclical written by His Holiness Pope Leo XIII on June 20th, 1888, on the nature of human liberty. Rob, can you tell us just briefly, in your own words, a good summary of what Libertas is?
Yeah, Libertas is a very important encyclical today. It addresses the errors of liberalism, which are pretty much universal today. We have liberals today and conservatives, and we think the conservatives aren't liberal, but in reality, both the conservatives and the liberals are actually liberals when you know what liberalism is. So the encyclical, it actually goes through and explains in detail, using metaphysics and theology, what the error of liberalism is, and then it gives practical applications of liberalism on the practical order. So it's very thorough. It addresses it theologically and then also practically.
Yeah, that's an excellent summary. Each of these encyclicals, they are paragraph by paragraph, and there's numbers for it. So when we refer to number 3 or paragraph 3, that's what we're talking about. So as I was reading through this, I was noticing a couple of different themes. First off, in paragraph 3, the Pope talks about this idea of moral liberty and natural liberty, and I think sometimes we get these things confused nowadays. Can you explain the differences between the two?
Yes. Actually, there's 3 kinds of liberty. There's natural liberty, which is essentially free will. It's the ability to make a rational, free choice. There's also moral liberty, which we'll get to in just a minute. The third one is physical liberty, which is the ability, like for someone in jail, for example, he doesn't have the physical liberty to go do what he wants to do. Or so we see how physical liberty is a physical constraint. Natural liberty is, again, the ability to make a rational choice. But the important one that the liberals never distinguish is moral liberty. Moral liberty is the boundaries for our natural liberty. Natural liberty is the ability to make a choice. Moral liberty determines what we are able to do, morally speaking. So that's the distinction that's very important. Leo XIII goes into that initially, and it cuts right to the heart of the liberal errors. For example, say America's a free country, okay, so we're free in America, but we're still required to obey the law. With our natural liberty, our free will, we have the ability to, say, run a red light. But since the law forbids us to run a red light, we're not morally bound to do so. So that's an example of the distinction between natural liberty, the ability to choose, and moral liberty, what we're allowed to choose. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I think a lot of times modernists and just people in general nowadays get those two confused because they don't even have any idea or understanding of the natural liberty that you spoke of. People will say, well, I have the freedom to choose whatever I want to, or to choose whichever religion I want to. They're obviously speaking about natural liberty there. Is that correct?
Exactly. They see I'm free, so I should be able to do what I want. Now, the only boundaries they'll establish is I should be able to do whatever I want as long as I don't harm somebody else. But actually, there's God's law to consider also. So we aren't free to do whatever we want, as long as we don't harm somebody else. We're free to do whatever we want within the boundaries of God's law. So I'm not free, for example, to tell a lie, because God forbids me to tell a lie. I have the ability to tell a lie because I have free will, but I'm not morally allowed to tell a lie. I can't morally kill somebody. I have the free will to kill somebody, but I'm not morally allowed to do it. The same thing when you get to the first 3 commandments, which no one pays attention to today. I'm not morally free to worship a false god because God forbids that. I'm not morally free to spread heresy because that's contrary to the first commandment. So that gives an idea of the distinction there. Also, we should realize that creation is made for an end. Okay, there's always an end in view of all created things. Each creature is constituted in view of its particular end. In other words, each creature is ordered to its end by its nature. Now, man was created for what? He was created ultimately for heaven, and therefore he's ordered to heaven by his nature. Now, we can only attain to heaven if we're elevated to the supernatural level by grace, which, of course, we don't have a right to. It's a gift given to us by God. But nevertheless, we're still ordered to heaven as our last end. That's what we were created for, and that's what we're ordered for. So our liberty, our no liberty, is independent of the end of the thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Modernists nowadays put this idea of natural liberty ahead of what we're speaking of, moral liberty now, I think, because they don't want, Rob, your morality put on them or mine. And so if you think about it, wouldn't it be fair to say that even that idea that I have the freedom to do whatever I want to as long as it doesn't hurt somebody else really has no foundation or grounds, because you could say, well, you do have the freedom to do that naturally. You have the freedom to kill somebody if you don't have that moral liberty component.
Right. That's exactly right.
So they're not really restrained by anything at all if they reject the idea of morality in general. Obviously, we see nowadays their life is not toward that goal or that end that we're speaking of. Their goal is this natural happiness, too, whatever makes me feel good now.
Right. Which is basically hedonism.
Right, and hedonism
goes into that. Pleasure becomes the measure of what's good. If it feels good, do it, you hear. So that he gets into this a little later in the encyclical.
Right, and that sounds like animals to me. Animals, hedonistic, they do whatever they need to do for that day or that moment. Where does this idea of natural liberty and free will, how does that relate to irrational creatures like animals and planets?
Well, man is a rational creature. Okay, the animals, they're not rational. They choose based on instinct or based on necessity. A dog eats because he's hungry. He doesn't have the reason. He can't say, I see these two choices of dog food here, and I think this one's probably a little healthier. So the other one looks more appetizing, but I'm going to choose the healthier dog food. See, they can't think that way. They're hungry, so they go to the first bowl of food, whichever one tastes better. Man has a reason to guide him. So that would be, does that answer the question, or are you looking for a little more?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely it. Man has that reason, but I think we both agree that a lot of times when we just go by this natural liberty, we're not really using our reason to its fullest.
Exactly. We're not using our reason to guide our will, is what it is. We're not using our reason to guide our choice. Do you see that?
Right, absolutely.
There, he gets into that.
Yep.
We'll get to that a little later in the encyclical. He goes into that
right.
in great
sure,
detail.
sure.
He shows how the intellect and the will work together, how the intellect must enlighten the will in its choice. But we'll get to that a little later in the encyclical.
Right, but I do think that this initial discussion is pretty important because the whole thing is talking about liberty, and especially nowadays in this culture now, religious liberty and free will, and I can do whatever I want to do as long as it doesn't infringe on somebody else. I think this encyclical in particular is almost more pertinent now than what it was when he wrote it. So,
right.
What I'd like to do, there's a couple of really good upcoming paragraphs 5 and 6. What I'd like to do is I'll read through some of it and stop in at certain points and kind of get your feedback on that. So paragraph 5, he says, liberty then, as we have said, belongs only to those who have the gift of reason or intelligence. And that's what we were speaking of.
Yeah, just
considered as...
that's because only some being with reason can make a rational choice. As we said with the dogs before, they can't decide between which dog food they want. They can't think in that terms. It's just based on instinct. The dog is hungry, so he goes for the food. So that's kind of what he's getting at there.
Right. He can. The Pope continues, considered as to its nature, it's the faculty of choosing means fitted for the end proposed, for he is the master of his actions, who can choose one thing out of many.
Yeah, so basically, our free will is not given to us so that we can choose between good and evil. You see, that's important. People think I'm free so I can choose whatever I want. No, our free will is given to us so we can choose the good. We can choose one good from another good. Again, the dog. The dog has two kinds of dog food. One is healthier than the other. He can't choose. We can. We can choose to eat carrots instead of junk food. So, for example, say a young man he's looking for a college to attend. Okay, he can then use his reason to investigate the numerous colleges in order to determine which college will best suit his needs. So in this case, he's not choosing good as opposed to evil. He's choosing which of the goods best serves his needs. So that's kind of an example there of a good use of our natural liberty. Again, our natural liberty is not given to us so we can choose good from evil. It's given to us so we can choose one good as opposed to another good. That's the reason for our free will. If we choose evil, that's an abuse of our free will.
And that's a really radical idea, especially, again, I go back to now in the current culture, the idea that we're free from a moral point of view to choose the good. Right. We don't have the right to choose evil.
Right. We have the ability, we don't have the right to choose evil. That's another thing you'll hear, the rights of man. The rights of man are never based on the objective good. You notice the objective good is always excluded from the notion of the rights of man. I have the right to free speech, right? Well, does that include the right to tell a lie? You see, because God forbids telling lies. Telling lies is objectively evil. So we don't have our right to free speech is not the right to tell a lie. But again, the liberals, they never discuss the objective order. It's always a subjective order, excluding the objective order.
Yeah, absolutely. Our rights come from God. God can't give us a right to be wrong or to worship the wrong God. So
not only that, but our rights proceed from and they flow from our duties. So, for example, God has all the rights. Okay, you start with the rights of God, and then based on his rights, he can command certain things. He has a right to command certain things of his creatures, of us. Okay? So he can give the 10 Commandments and command us to follow them. Then we, his creatures, have the corresponding duty to obey God and keep his commandments. And then below that, we have the right to the means necessary to fulfill our duties to God. We don't have the right to violate God's law. We have the right to the means necessary to obey God and to fulfill his law.
Yep. And you mentioned something real briefly that I think it's important to go back over, objective versus subjective good.
Uh-huh.
Could you explain just real briefly the difference? You were talking about the objective good in regards to making decisions and our free will versus morality.
Yeah, the objective good is the good. Legal Thursday, we'll go into this little more detail later, but the objective good is the good in conformity with right reason. And right reason is reason informed by God's law, you see? So the objective good is the good in conformity with right reason. And right reason is reason informed by God's law. So you see the vertical there. It's God's law.
Right.
He informs our reason, okay, our intellect, our reason, and then our reason then directs our will and its choice. So the true good is the good in conformity with right reason. Subjectively, you can have a subjective good. Now our will, again, he goes into this further in great detail later, but our will has two functions, you could say. It desires, it loves, okay, desires, and it also chooses, okay? But the will is a blind faculty. Okay? It's always going to desire a good because good is the object of the will. In other words, good is what the will is naturally ordered to. So it's only going to desire a good. The problem is the will is a blind faculty. See, so it can't determine or distinguish a true good from a merely apparent good. Okay, so a drug addict, for example, he's going to desire his drugs. What's the good he's desiring? He's desiring the good feeling that comes from the drugs, or he's desiring to be rid of the bad feeling he doesn't have without the drugs. But his desire is ordered to a disordered good. So it always needs the intellect. The object of the intellect is the true. So the will, which is the blind faculty, needs the intellect that has the truth to direct it in its choice. You see? So the intellect, it desires and it chooses. The desire is blind. It's just going to have a vague desire for the good, maybe true good, maybe not true good. But then it also has to choose. Okay? Just because it desires something doesn't mean it's going to choose that thing. So it needs the intellect that has the truth to direct the desires and to direct it in its choice. Did that answer the question?
Absolutely. Yep, perfect. Okay, but back to paragraph 5 from the Pope. He continues, now since everything chosen as a means is viewed as good or useful, and since good as such is the proper object of our desire, it follows that freedom of choice is a property of the will, or rather is identical with the will, insofar as it has in its action the faculty of choice. That goes back to what we were just discussing as well.
Exactly what I was just saying. Basically, he's saying that choice, okay, is a function of the will, not the intellect. That makes perfect sense. Your choice is a function of the will, okay? That's what he's saying there. And like mentioned before, the will desires and it chooses, but it's a blind faculty, so it needs the intellect to direct it in its choice. So basically, exactly what we just said.
Yeah, I think a good distinction that you made earlier as well, especially with the drug addict, this idea of perceived good versus a moral good. Everybody that does things, they obviously do because they think they're getting something good out of it, but that's their perception of, but it doesn't mean it's an objective, true good.
Right.
Yep, excellent. Very good, very good. All right, continuing with Libertas, also in paragraph 5, just because this is such a good paragraph, but the will cannot proceed to act until it is enlightened by the knowledge possessed by the intellect. In other words, the good wished by the will is necessarily good insofar as it is known by the intellect. And this is the more because in all voluntary acts, choice is subsequent to a judgment upon the truth of the good presented, declaring to which good preference should be given. No sensible man can doubt that judgment is an act of reason, not of the will. The end or object both of the rational will and of its liberty, is that good only which in conformity with reason.
Yeah, that's a deep sentence right there, or deep paragraph, but it's basically exactly what we just talked about a minute ago. He explains that the intellect judges what is truly good. Remember, we talked about that before, as opposed to what is only perceived as a good or desired by the will. Just what we said before. And the will then is free to embrace or reject it. So it's basically exactly what we were just saying. Yeah, so if you see what he says, right, what he says, basically he's saying that the true object of the will, remember we said the will, the object of the will is the good. The true object of the will is that which is in conformity with right reason. In other words, it's what the intellect judges to be truly good, because the intellect is the judge. Again, we've said 100 times already, the will is a blind faculty. It only desires, it can't judge. It needs the intellect to judge so it can then direct the will in its choice. And he'll explain further on that true freedom or true liberty is not doing what we want, what we desire, but doing what we ought. And what we ought is that which is in conformity with right reason. But another point here, since man has a fallen nature, okay, both his intellect, which judges the true, and his will, which desires the good, are subject to error, okay? That's important. So not only can the will choose something other than what the intellect proposes as good. Okay, so my intellect tells me I need to lose 50 pounds. Okay, we'll say I need to lose 50 pounds. And so my intellect says, okay, that bag of Cheetos there, you should just eat, 10 Cheetos. That's what my intellect tells my will. But what's my will going to say? My will's going to say, no, eat the whole bag of Cheetos. Okay, so
Right.
that shows how your will can still choose something other than what your will can choose something other than what the intellect directs it toward. Okay, the intellect says only eat 10 Cheetos. Will says I want to eat the whole bag of Cheetos. You see, so that's what it's basically going to be saying here is that our intellect and our will are both defective. So our will can choose something other than what the intellect tells us to choose, but not only that, our intellect can also judge wrong. So it can make an error in judgment, and then it can misdirect the will and its choice. So we'll be getting further on to show how that then is rectified, how the defect in the intellect is rectified.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we see nowadays, too, this defect in intellect is partly due to the environment as well, poor education, poor catechesis, that sort of thing, that not even necessarily knowing the right or the wrong thing to do, and so just going by what feels good. And I think that's what we see nowadays as well.
Yeah, another point is that, we have the natural law. The natural law, and again, he explains this further on, it's a participation in the eternal law of God that's stamped upon man's reason. So you have the eternal law of God, the eternal moral law. That law of God is stamped upon man's reason, okay? By virtue of that natural law, man has a sense of right and wrong, okay? It's just natural that man has a sense of a right and wrong. However, that can, in a sense, be overridden because the natural law is in our reason, right? Well, where's knowledge? Knowledge, or what we think is true, is also in our reason. And in a sense, knowledge, our belief, can actually be more powerful than the natural law. So what does that mean? What it means is if someone embraces an error, that error can, at least to a degree, override what they know by virtue of the natural law, because the natural law is kind of subtle, it's not real distinct. We have a sense of right and wrong, but it's not real clear. But that's actually why we need real knowledge, because real knowledge supports what the natural law already tells us. But bad knowledge, it twists everything, you see, and it tells someone that what is wrong is actually right, or what is right is actually wrong. And that's what we have in our society today, and that's why I think we have so many psychological issues, because people have this wrong information of intellect, this wrong quote-unquote knowledge telling them that good is bad and bad is good, but in reality, the natural law that's stamped upon their reason, it knows the difference. It knows that's wrong. So there's a conflict within the person by what the natural law instinctively kind of lets them know, and the false knowledge they have in the intellect, and then this conflict, this dualism within the one being manifests itself in all these psychological issues we have today, depression, all these things. I bet that all these psychological issues are rooted to a large extent in the false knowledge, the wrong information that's in people's head.
Oh yeah, absolutely. For the most part, there's some organic issues going on with some people, but absolutely, I think not knowing, having bad information, and we don't mean just one or two times being given bad information, right? We mean over and over again, the whole culture being saturated with it. There's issues nowadays that are being proposed to the general public as the right thing, when really it's the exact opposite to just even the natural law. But we see that the more you're presented with error, over and over again, and depending on who's telling you that, your father or a bishop or whomever, then you're more likely to fall with that as well. And so it's pretty hard to kind of come out of that stupor if your intellect has been malformed from the very beginning. That'll have to do it for this episode of the Veritas Podcast. Next time we will continue our discussion on Pope Leo's Libertas.